welcome back. We starting a new segment here. It's called JESS SAYIN. As many of you know, our pastor here at Souls Harbor, Pastor Jesse Cottrell, you'll see a lot of these things pop up on his Facebook from time to time. And so this segment will kind of be an interview segment with him, discussing topics that he's learned over, almost 40 years in ministry. So some great advice that can be taken from this. And so today we're going to discuss the topic of evangelism. Him and his wife served on the evangelistic field for 6 years before they became pastors of Souls Harbor here in Walnut, Mississippi. So so today we're going to want to just talk to you a little bit, Brother Chair, just kind of get your insights on evangelism, how somebody who wants to get involved in evangelism can pursue that in their ministry.
Okay. Well, first of all, I think it's a calling. That's the main thing. If you have a calling, anything will work. I've seen a lot of people over the years that seemingly thought it was a good idea, thought it was really fascinating and a good way to spend your life. But if you're not really committed to the cause of evangelism, I felt like that I was called to evangelize. In fact, when I first started preaching, I would have thought that I never would pastor. I had no idea that I would ever pastor a church, or be privileged to pastor a church. But as time went on, God called me into a pastoral ministry that I didn't think at the time that I would ever be a part of. In fact, we had a minister to call me and tell me about a church availability in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and I told him, I said, well, brother, I'll go. And so they wanted you to come and prospectively be a pastor of the church. And when I went, I thought, I don't want to do this. But when I got there was something about it that just got a hold of my heart. And it was relatively close to my home, and we'd been evangelizing for several years. And I thought, this wouldn't be too bad, just a short drive to my mom and brother's house. And I thought, this might be a thing. And in fact, as time went on and transpired, I kind of thought, after I didn't get it, I thought, oh, my Lord, I thought this was but I feel like that was a place where God was talking to me and letting me know that it was going to come a time where God would provide for such a time as this for me. And a few months later, this church where we are now and have been for 31 years now became available. So evangelism was my passion, and it still is. But God's called us into this ministry for this phase of our lives, and we're happy and have some of the greatest people in the world. John?
And like I said, it's one of the things, looking back, I know you didn't really understand it at the time when all these things were opening up and stuff, but you kind of see where God kind of is lining things up throughout your life. You've even had a conversation before about how, you may not have got the one in Baton Rouge, the opportunity, but it opened up your mind for pastoralship. That's how God works. So, Booker, I want to ask you just a few questions tonight, and then let's go from there. So how old were you when you started feeling the calling that God had on your life?
Most people don't believe this, but just as a young child, I had a special affection for the things of God. Became obsessed almost with the church. I can remember walking to the church. Remember the day we got new pews and stayed there all day, and it was just a passion of mine. It wasn't uncommon for me to find myself at the church, wanting to lock the doors and fill up the Coke machine in the back. I enjoyed that part because I usually got me a Coke out of the job. But, as time went on, I just felt there was a compelling there. Of course, my cousin David Cottrell and I, somebody said, well, I found out that Brother David felt like he was called, and then I felt like I was called. But I don't feel it was that way, but it kind of probably seemed that way because we accepted our callings about the same time. Unfortunately, I didn't really delve into it as deeply as I should have probably at that time. What I found myself doing was, we had fellowship meetings on Friday night once a month back then, and my little 5 minutes to fellowship meeting kind of sufficed for me. But as time went on, of course, all that was training and all that was equipping me for the ministry. It's not something that you just walk into. It's not something that develops overnight for most people. Now, I'm sure there are people like Brother Carpenter, somebody like that just started and just seemed like it. I've heard him tell his stories of how that one thing just opened up and another one opened up. It wasn't quite that fast for me. Of course, I'm probably not the preacher Brother Carpenter is either, so that might have had something to do. But we do enjoy the ministry, and I just studied and remained faithful. Remain faithful to your home church. God's not going to bless you abroad until He blesses you where you are now. So it's that law of sowing and reaping really stands out. You sow bountifully, you reap bountifully. You sow sparingly, you reap sparingly.
And again, that's one thing that Bucket Chair has instilled in us here at Souls Harbor is just give God everything. You can't expect God to give you something. It's like if you own a business, you can't expect a return unless you put something in. And so that's what it's about. And you've kind of answered this question a little bit a while ago with Bucket Chair, but what did you start doing when you felt your calling?
Well, you could never ever underestimate, of course, prayer. I think I've attained more through prayer than anything. Prayer's key that unlocks the door. Sunday school teacher used to say that all the time. And when you pray, you become more sensitive. And when you become more sensitive, you become more insightful because God allows things to open up. I'll find something that might just prick my heart or make me think, there's something there. Might not understand what it is at the time. Maybe don't have a message that develops out of it, but I'll jot that thought down. Sometimes it may be a year or two later, maybe 3 years later, sometimes even longer than that. But that scripture, it pricked something in my conscience for a reason. And so after that, then I just started studying. So I think prayer would be the most important thing. I found a fasting commitment day. I remember when I first started fasting, I fasted every Thursday. That was my day to fast. It just, it adds gasoline to the fire. Prayer, if prayer's the gas, then fasting is the match that lights that fire. And just a cumulative effect. So prayer and fasting, and of course study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needed not be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. You can tell when somebody studies. You can tell when somebody doesn't study as much. And it just makes you more aware and keenly sensitive to the things of the Lord. So I say if you pray and you fast and you study the Word of God, if you're called, your gift and your calling will make room for itself and bring you before great men. So that would be my key. I think prayer, fasting, and study, effectual, fervent prayer, and of a righteous man. Try to do that right. Live what you preach. If you don't live what you preach, you're not going to be able to preach like you live.
Man, that's very true. Just like I said, just giving them everything you've got. Spend time with God because, I know as a young minister myself who's starting to come up, like I've learned myself, you can't expect to get up there and minister to folks when you're not putting everything into it before you get up there. Like you can't. If you ain't prayed all week, but then you get up there and you try to carry a message, it's going to show. It's going to show forth, I believe. And so that's just one thing you got to make sure you understand is as much as important as it is inside the church, it's just as important outside the church. Now, fast forward a little bit for the church, like we talked about your calling, you accepting your calling, things that you've done and get to that point. Now you're on the evangelistic field. How did you, with all the scheduling of revivals and opportunities coming open, how was you able to handle that schedule? And also, if I'm not mistaken, you were married and had 2 kids as well on the evangelistic field. So how did you balance that life between scheduling evangelist and balancing your family as well?
Okay. Well, number one, I had a good family. I had a wife that shared my calling, that put her life on hold, and her aspirations and her dream for her life. She put it on hold. That's probably the best secret that I had, because it wouldn't have mattered what I have done had my wife not been there. Also, my children, especially when we were evangelizing, they were deprived of a normal life. I don't think people really realize that. People that took time with my children whenever we were doing evangelistic work. I remember Pastor Hammond up in Ohio. We were there one day, and some kid in the neighborhood had a bicycle, and my son really wanted a bicycle, and I'll never forget. I don't know what it was, $30, $40 for a little small bicycle with training wheels on it. That pastor went out and bought it while we were there and evangelizing, trying to get it all situated in a trailer and in a truck, and we were kind of limited what we could carry, but we carried that bicycle all over the place. We still got that bicycle. I saw it the other day, and just little things like that. But my children, they never complained about traveling. Maybe they weren't old enough, I don't know, but my family that put themselves, and we changed them and deprived them of a normal childhood, but they never complained about it. And they, to this point, we're just trying to do the best we can. Children, ideally, I think it probably would be better if a couple didn't have children while they were evangelizing. Then there may be those that would say, well, yeah, but you couldn't relate to somebody and how they felt about their children had you not had children. So, you could counteract one with the other, but ideally it's rough on the family. But my family was mutually supported above me while we were doing it, and God blessed me with a great family. And now I've got grandkids, so that just adds fuel to the fire.
And that's just, as a new dad myself, that's probably one thing. I know you sometimes will wonder, like, well, did we do the right thing or whatever, but I feel like what y'all instilled in Lance and Amanda, they can now one day instill in their kids. So, it will continue through generations, I believe. So, that's awesome. Next question, Brother Chair. What was your favorite moment while on the evangelistic field?
Now, that was a tough one there. I don't know if I could tell you a favorite moment. I can tell you particular times that were more important or more joyous, or I guess is whenever you get through preaching and the altars start coming. Because it doesn't matter if all the semantics are right, if all your wording's right, you got good illustrations, all those things are components that work as a means toward an end. But the real litmus test of effective evangelism is the results that you have in the altar. And so my fondest times were praying with folks that I had preached them into the altar. We use that terminology sometime. I'm not sure I preached them into the altar. I feel like the Spirit of the Lord drew them there through the medium of us as evangelists. He brought them to the altar. And nothing was more exciting to me, I don't think, than knowing that someone came to the altar as a result of your preaching and God marvelously filled them with the Holy Ghost. And you could see it all over their face. Their lives were automatically transformed right before your eyes. And I would think that if I were to put a premium on it, I was privileged to preach a youth convention a couple of times, even preached at the General Conference one year in Dallas, and all those times, and preaching for some of the grandest people, the Pools and the Wilson. I mean, I could just go on and on and on, and I just messed up calling names, but just the privilege of being able to, when someone shares your pulpit with him, I would think that might be akin to you sharing your wife with somebody. And I know that sounds a little ludicrous, but the truth of it is, it's our most valuable possession. I'm careful who I allow to preach in our pulpit. Somebody's going to come in there and beat my sheep. It's kind of like, with your children. You don't want somebody else to come in there and beat your kids. They may need a strapping or striping, but I'd rather do it. And because I know when I do it, I'll do it out of love. And I've just always tried to keep that in mind whenever I was evangelizing. Those are not your kids. And what you can do with your kids, you might not be able to do with somebody else's kids. So, but I would think that probably watching somebody come in or even during the maturation process, and I know you were referring to the evangelistic days, but pastoralship, somebody come into your church, start visiting, start liking the church, coming back, making a frequent visitor. Then you watch as conviction gets a hold of them and they come to the altar. Then it's not long until they're speaking in tongues, and not long after that until they're asking you to baptize them. And why do we do this? And why do we not do that? And why do we not do this? And why do we do that? There's something in you when you see somebody that has a hunger to do more, to grow in the fear and the admonition of God. So I hope that answered the question.
It did, definitely. I can definitely see that being a very impactful moment. Or moments in a ministry is seeing people transform right before your eyes. And then, if I'm not mistaken, there's probably times where you'd see those people pray through in one revival, and then if you repeated another revival for that same preacher, come back and see how they've grown in that little bit of time that you went away. Right. And so those moments kind of carry with you the rest of your ministry, because you say, hey, not that you're patting yourself on the back or anything, but hey, I had a part in why that person is still here today. So I feel like that would be a huge milestone in a ministry. Last question, Brother Jaron. I won't take up much more of your time. What advice would you give somebody who's already kind of stepped into ministry, but maybe feeling that tug of maybe to go out and evangelize, or maybe to go out and kind of get their feet wet on the evangelistic field? What advice would you give to that person who wants to move towards evangelizing?
Well, I heard a story one time about this guy that came to his pastor and told him he wanted to be a missionary. And his pastor said, "You'll never be a missionary." He said, but I could just think of traveling the world, flying all over the world and preaching the gospel, and maybe in Africa or India or somewhere like that. And he said, you probably won't do that. And the little boy was kind of aggravated and frustrated with his pastor. And he said, "What do you mean? How can you say that?" He said, "How much evangelizing are you doing at home? How many people are you winning at home? How many people have you asked to come to church with you? How many people have you been a direct result of them being born or birthed into the church?" And the fellow said, "Well, what makes you think that God's going to send you around the world to preach the gospel to people you don't even know and you couldn't care about, you don't even know who they are, when you haven't done the same thing for people, even some of your closest friends, you've never had an impact on bringing them to the church?" So what I would say is evangelism starts at home. And when I say at home, I don't mean necessarily in a home church. It starts in your home. You'll never be an effective winner if you don't win the confidence of your children, of your wife, or whoever that might be. So my advice is, number one, live the life. Be faithful. We keep going back to that. If you do this, then God does that. If you're not faithful to God, and your home church. You can forget God being faithful to you, taking you abroad, because there's just that law of the harvest. We call it the law of the harvest. But what I would tell them is to be faithful, be loyal, be dependable. Support your pastor. You won't always agree with every isolated incident that your pastor does, but God will reward your faithfulness. Remember this: if you're not faithful to your pastor and God ever allows you to advance into a place of pastoral authority, that you have sown will show up in what you reap whenever you become there. So my advice for someone that's just wanting to make a move toward evangelizing, be faithful. And if you'll be faithful, God will be faithful to you. And then I would say study. You know, you never get a second chance to make a good first impression. When you preach, people will determine probably within the first few minutes of whether you've been studying or whether you haven't. And especially if they're a Bible student, they're not going to listen to some novice. And if they can tell that you've been acquainted and you're familiar with the word of the Lord, I've seen preachers to get up and I don't mean to demean anybody, but they'd read their text and mispronounce the words, barely get through reading the text, and I'm thinking, man, this is going to be good. This guy can't even read the text. How's he going to expositorily preach it? You know, and people notice that. You know, you might not know who Demosthenes is or Aristotle, or you might not know who Adonibezek is, but learn who they are. Learn who they are. Be familiar, especially with your text. I heard a preacher preaching not too long ago, and he was going, I won't expose it, but he was talking about something, and I could tell he hadn't read his text, because if he'd read his text, he would have known what happened. But he didn't even know what happened. And I'm thinking, how did you miss that? Studying for this message. You know, so, you know, this is an intelligent generation. There was a time when spit and hollering and screaming and slinging your arms and flinging yourself across the stage would impress people. But people are intelligent today, and they know, and they want, if they want to learn, they want to learn from somebody that knows the book. Know that book. Study. Know that book. Know it like the back of your hand. Be familiar with your text. Read the chapter before, read the chapter after, and then come back to your text. And that way you can fit it into where it goes. So I believe that's probably what I would say. And then if you desire the office of a bishop, then that must be what God's calling you to. If you just want to evangelize like I did, then you might think that that's the epitome of where God wants to take you. But don't be surprised as your ministry grows and flourishes that God opens up a door entirely different than anything you would have ever thought you have ever done. And you find yourself in a place, because that's what God does. He places us. He said that He would bring us before great men. So just study, pray, fast. You can't study that book enough. It's no telling how many times. Every time I open up a book and I look at the book, I start thinking, I never saw it on this wise before. I didn't just read that in one of the Gospels. I read that from my heart today, because sometimes I'll open it up and I think, why in the world haven't I seen this already? But that's the power of the written word. It's alive, and it's changing, ever changing. So study, pray, fast, commit to God, because, you know, nobody gonna get you to build their house till they've seen what you've done somewhere. Most of yours are gonna come. Somebody's gonna have first house, but they're gonna look at what you're doing and be an example. in all things. One more thing I want to say. There were times in our ministry where and I feel like this made us more successful. There were times in our lives when we preached for preachers that believed things that we didn't necessarily believe. But what we did was we tried to go as plain Jane as we could, because at all cost, I want to win some. And because of that, God allowed me to preach for some people and reach some congregations because we were willing to sacrifice. Remember, as much as fasting and praying and studying the Word, the next word that comes to my mind right now is sacrifice. You're not willing to sacrifice, you're probably not called. Kind of straight, but that's kind of the way it is. Because the Bible said to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. I see my time's running out, Brother John, but go ahead.
I just want to kind of add a couple things to what you said a while ago, Brother Couture. One, you said it starts at home. And you need to have the confidence of your wife, your children, because ultimately that's your support system. That's the ones that are there in your corner, the ones that's supposed to be backing you up. And so if they don't believe what you're saying, it's going to be hard for you to convince somebody else to believe what you're saying.
You don't win them.
No.
You won't win some.
That's right. And then also you said like about being submissive to your pastor, and that's one thing I'm a firm believer in. Me and my wife actually just had a conversation the other day and was just talking about how, and not to throw anybody under the bus or nothing, but just you see it so much with people, even people that you know in church, is they're one way at home, but if they were off on vacation, completely different people. They'll sit there and they'll crop their pictures out because maybe in shorts, maybe in something that they didn't know they shouldn't be doing. And versus getting caught by the pastor, they want to sit there and make it seem as if everything's still okay. And there's only one word to call that, but hypocritical. And you can't be that way and expect to be used, I feel like, of God. Because, I mean, if your man of God preaches something a certain way, go by what he says. Go by what is preached from your platform. Because that's the only way God's going to be able to bless your ministry is 100% submissive to your pastor, I believe. And then just, like you said, just study and know that you got to be prepared. I mean, again, as a young minister, when I first started getting involved in ministry, it terrified me to stand up behind a pulpit. I got to the point, my first message I ever preached, my knees shook the entire time. I was terrified. I think I preached it. Yeah. I had like 20-30 minutes worth of notes, and I think I did it all in 5 minutes. Like it just terrified me. But as time went on, and just you learn and you can perfect those things. But like I said, it's just one of those like I said, just be submissive and always know that if you put God number one, I mean, He'll always come through for you. So, Brother Jared, we appreciate you coming on today. Is there anything else you want to comment or anything you'd like to say?
No, it's just I'd just like to say that over the years we've had the privilege to work with several ministers, and without exception, without fail, those that have been faithful, those that have been supportive, those that have been subject to our preaching are the ones that have been blessed. And so if you'll be blessed, you might not be the smartest guy in the world. You might not be the most persuasive guy in the world. But if you'll be faithful, and if you'll give your heart to God, God will use you in His work. I hope it's been a blessing to you. I don't know how much I know. I don't know a whole lot, but I know that God is good, and He's greatly to be praised.
We appreciate you coming on. It was great. I enjoyed it. I think people can take a lot from this and apply it to their ministry as well. Like I said, you're talking about a man here that over almost 40 years of ministry that, I mean, you've been through some things, you've seen some things that we haven't yet. And so it's everything that I took from this. And so I appreciate you coming on. We love you. And like I said again, this is our pastor here at Souls Harbor, Pastor Jesse Contreras. And until next time, God bless you all.